Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, our BCT Conservation webinar on fire management. I'm Joel Stibbard, an ecologist in the education team here at the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. Forgive my croaky voice today, I'm battling a winter bug, but I'm on the mend, and you can't say we're not committed to bringing you good stuff. All right, so I come to you today from Darug country in Parramatta, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which I sit, and indeed those of all the lands that this webinar extends to today. Conservation is about finding ways to restore traditional practices that we know shaped and nurtured the Australian continent for hundreds of thousands of years. And this requires learning from traditional owners of this great southern land. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us here in the virtual room. And really, when we think about Aboriginal land management, one of the first things we think about is fire, right? Fire management has shaped the Australian landscape for hundreds of thousands of years, directly influencing native species biology and the ecological processes of our natural systems as the landscapes have evolved with fire implemented by Aboriginal peoples. But like so many other things, us white folk went and turned up and we messed it all up, modifying fire regimes or removing them altogether post-colonisation. Yet the multitude of benefits that come with burning country are now, just like a cool burn itself, seeping its way into the mainstream conversations on land management. And I don't think it's too controversial for me to say that many landholders are keen to see appropriate fire reintroduced to the landscape, not only for cultural and ecological benefits, but also for hazard reduction, reducing biomass to stave off those intense wildfires that we all want to avoid. The tricky bit then is, how do we determine what an appropriate burn regime is for an area? And how can we reintroduce that burn-in regime in the face of obstacles that just weren't there 200 plus years ago? I'm talking about, the approvals process and the bureaucracy that comes with it, the risk to people and property, insurance premiums, and appeasing the concerns of your neighbours, among others. And how can burns be implemented that mitigate bushfire risk, restore ecological integrity, and provide a means for cultural connection? Well, with me today to talk through it is resident BCT old head, Melissa Huntsman. Hope you don't mind me saying that, Mel. An integral member of our technical team who was instrumental in bringing together our Fire for Conservation Management guidelines. And we have both Jane Mansergh, I hope I got that right, Jane, and Jamie Bertram from the Rural Fire Service and Nature Conservation Council's Hotspots program. Jane is the environmental coordinator of Hotspots, while Jamie is a Wiradjuri and Gumbungiya man who leads Aboriginal engagement and Aboriginal programs out of the Coffs Harbour office. Both have decades of experience in the many facets of fire management, so it is a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much. And as always, we have Q&A after the presentations, so be sure to put your questions into Slido. I'll have them here. We had a ton of questions come in as part of the registration for the webinar, and we've got a lot of people online today, which is fantastic, so make sure you get those questions in. We've anticipated also going a little bit over time today, if necessary. So if questions are firing, we will do that. Pun intended, right? So still, if there aren't any we can't get to, make sure that we will deal with them, handle it, provide some info back to you in future correspondence. We also have another video right at the end today to show you, so stick around for that. All right, look, I've dribbled on enough. So I'd now like to introduce Mel Huntsman to speak to us about the guidance that BCT provides around fire management and what opportunities are available to BCT agreement holders to design and implement fire plans on conservation sites. Mel has engaged extensively with agencies like the RFS and cultural groups, along with individual landholders, to develop our fire management guidelines, and it's great to have her join us today to present on her learnings. Over to you, Mel.
Perfect. Thank you, Joel. Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy and excited to be here with everyone today. So I'm going to run through the presentation with you on three kind of separate topics. The first that I'm going to touch on is in relation to fire as a management tool for cultural and/or ecological outcomes. The second is around bushfire preparedness, focusing on hazard reduction and how this interacts with private land conservation agreements. And then the third is what happens after a bushfire and the support that BCT could provide. We understand for our in perpetuity agreements that fire is going to be part of generally part of the story or the experience for the majority of our landholders, and we're always looking for ways to be able to support and help our landholders through this process. To start off, I think it's also really important to note that BCT is not a fire authority, which is why we have our friends here from RFS. So while we can advise on some aspects generally around the kind of ecological components, hazard reduction risks are a role for RFS and are outside our realm of, I guess, influence and ability to provide support on. Next slide, perfect, thank you. So a quick introduction around to provide some context. There's 3 types of burning that we'll touch on today, just to provide a little bit of an overview. So cultural burning is centered around cultural outcomes and burning for increasing the health of country. Jamie will touch more on this, but I think it's important to note that those objectives are cultural. They could be spiritual and ecological, as well as continuing cultural practice, the connection to country, and function as like a learning and culture building for community. They're undertaken by community, for community, based on and with Aboriginal knowledge holders as well. This is different to ecological burning, where the burns are focused on generally a specific ecosystem or species and follows government frameworks and policies. It's generally implemented by fire ecologists, fire practitioners, or landholders. And then the third type of burning is hazard reduction burning. So the purpose of this is purely around the risk mitigation component, where cultural and ecological burning will have an impact on biomass and can reduce bushfire hazard. It is not the primary purpose for that burn. And the hazard reduction burn is largely led in the space of RFS and other similar agencies as well. So, and the hazard reduction burns also abide by the fire frequencies for that. Thank you. To help with burning, BCT has developed the guide for the application of fire as a management tool to assist landholders through the processes of determining if a burn is appropriate for your property, and then onto implementing a burn. This is available on our website, free for everyone to have a look at. It's set up as a principles-based framework to assist landholders with burning for cultural and/or ecological outcomes, and for a range of circumstances. It's principle-based because there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Every landholder's land is going to be different, and there's always going to be different considerations that need to be taken into account for the property and also the time that you're looking to burn as well. So it provides a framework to support landholders, determine the purpose of the burn, understand whether burning is appropriate, the need and scope of strategic or individual burn plans, any monitoring or annual reporting requirements, and also adaptive management. So for your agreement, you'll need to refer to that to determine how burning is supported in your agreement. Some agreements will be very explicit in saying that burning is enabled. Some others will be very explicit in saying that burning is not enabled. Where burning, it's not very clear, generally burning supported where it contributes to the objectives of the agreement. If you're not clear on that, your BCT regional officer can support you through that process as well, and provide some advice in writing. So where burning, as I mentioned, is not explicitly mentioned, you could use this flowchart here to help determine whether burning is appropriate for your agreement. So the first step is determining the primary aim and purpose of the burn. This could be whether the burning is appropriate for the ecosystem and plant community. For example, BCT will not support burning in vegetation formations that are negatively impacted by fire, such as rainforests, wetlands and some wetlands and alpine complexes. The next step is to determining whether burning is actually achievable for your agreement. So is the topography or the safety going to be too hard to overcome, that another disturbance regime to achieve similar ecological outcomes may be more appropriate. Can potential impacts to cultural heritage items or threatened species be actively avoided? And if not, are there other disturbance regimes? And this is also important to note that this is progressive and agile, that we need to work on continuous improvement for these spaces as well. So where burning is appropriate, BCT can work to establish a new support fire management objectives for your property as well. Perfect, thank you. Next slide. Once you've determined whether burning is appropriate, the next step is to work through planning for the burn. So determining the burn regime can be complex. There are many other people who are much smarter than me that have done a lot of work in this space in looking at burn regimes, fire frequencies, around vegetation formations as well. I know that Hotspots has a number of resources on this, and then also people like a fire ecologist can support you in this process. So the guide establishes a number of principles to look at the planned burning, again, because there's no one size fits all type of approach. So some of the things for consideration may be the fire history of the surrounding landscape. We're wanting to make sure that there's a diversity of burn times throughout the landscape, the disturbance history of the landscape and the agreement. If the site's already been highly modified, or if there's been drought, excluding fire may be the best option for that property. The flexibility for other factors, such as new published literatures that's come out recently, and then also the application of the precautionary principle by leaving large areas unburnt in a mosaic pattern as well. And then I guess the other thing for that as well is that for a number of our agreements, we are looking to recommend a strategic burn plan, which is similar to, I guess, a property burn plan, but specific for the agreement. And this is looking at the long-term kind of burn units and fire frequencies for your specific agreement over a longer period of time, and then an operational burn plan for the individual burn event. We also recognise that for Aboriginal people, that the format of these type of documents may be in the form of a seasonal calendar or other type of appropriate other format to enable either the reintroduction or the continual of cultural practices and the burning within their land as well. Perfect. The other item just to touch on as well is for contacts for a burn plan. We generally are recommending fire ecologists for this, and I know Jane will also touch on some other opportunities through Hotspots for this as well. But when you're engaging a fire planner, our guide does outline some recommendations around looking at previous experience in similar scenarios, and also what kind of qualifications and insurances that they have as part of that. So this is a bit of a complex space. Burn approvals. The current legislation is complex, and it doesn't provide a single pathway for this space. So there's multiple, a terrible kind of choose your own adventure, if you will, in certain situations. Because under legislation, burning is generally considered land clearing, it does push you down those pathways of land clearing to get approval for burning. Hazard reduction certificates could be an option depending on the purpose and the scope of your burn. Ultimately, the Bushfire Environmental Assessment Code is very clear on the circumstances in which a hazard reduction burn will be provided, and generally it is, what it says within that document is that it's for hazard reduction outcomes. So that's something that you'll need to speak to your RFS representatives about. And otherwise, that it might be something that you're talking to your fire practitioner about in consultation with BCT as well. There's also, I think it's important to note that there are also additional barriers around cultural burning as well, and that the current legislation disproportionately impacts Aboriginal people in that space, and there are challenges in that space, particularly around commercial cultural burning through the Local Land Services Act. And I know that these are things that are being looked into as part of the current Act reviews that are being undertaken. Just looking at my notes if there's anything else to add on that. I know Jane is going to touch on this space as well. Perfect. The next slide, thank you. As BCT is not a fire authority, we're encouraging landholders to engage with RFS when considering hazard reduction activities. This relationship's really important, and we continue to work collaboratively with RFS and encourage our landholders to do the same. The Bushfire Assessment Code, Environmental Assessment Codes requires that hazard reduction activities that are undertaken are consistent with the terms of a BCT agreement, and BCT is available to support landholders and RFS determining whether those proposed activities or how those proposed activities can be consistent with the agreement. Our recommendation is to be proactive. We want to be able to address these concerns before we're in a situation where there is an emergency or there is an extreme fire risk. We encourage landholders to look at the terms of the agreements that they have, and things like whether you have clearing allowances around your tracks that you might be looking to actually implement proactively, so that that's something that you already have set up. It's important to also note that the emergency powers under the Rural Fires Act override the BC Act and also the agreement conditions. So being proactive in engaging with RFS and BCT can minimise the risk of adverse outcomes when there is those emergency situations that do come up from time to time. Next slide, please. Thanks. I just want to provide a short example of out west where we did have a landholder and their neighbour come to us about a perceived bushfire risk within a conservation agreement. This was a photo, the photo on the left, I think that's the left, yep, is kind of looking out across the field, and the second is looking down into the spacing of the tussocks there. RFS came out on site with the landholder and the neighbours, and they advised that their fire risk for this property was no different to the surrounding landscapes, and in reality that if a fire went through, there was nothing really that was going to be done on this property that would really change the outcome. And as a result, at this point in time, no hazard reduction activities were recommended. And we do know that there is sometimes a perception that conservation agreements can increase bushfire risk, and it isn't always the case. It needs to be looked at kind of from that landscape perspective. So I think this is where that engagement with RFS is really important, and working with BCT if these type of questions and queries do come up. Then, unfortunately, despite everyone's best efforts, there will likely be a time that there is, or you already have been impacted by bushfire. When this occurs, or if this occurs and when you're ready, BCT can be a touch point for discussing the impact on your property and your conservation agreement area. We have your regional staff who can assist with technical advice regarding the ecological impact of the fire and also the restoration that you might need for your conservation area. There are some resources up there. We have a fact sheet that kind of talks through the, I guess, the approach that BCT recommends following a burn. And we also have a resource that's been specifically prepared by our Southeast Regional team for the bushfire recovery, for vegetation recovery after a bushfire, which is a great resource as well. There also is options for, if you don't have a funded agreement, for grants to support you in recovery. And if you have a funded agreement or a biodiversity stewardship agreement, it's recommended that you contact BCT to talk about opportunities that are available for adaptive management, whether that's reallocating money to different actions or pausing certain actions for a period in time as well. And the last resource that I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to was something that Joel and the education team put together, led by Joel, is the e-learning that's available on our website. There is one specifically on fire for conservation management. It's a great resource that was developed in partnership with the Department of Primary Industries, Tokul College, and is free for everyone to access and available to complete on there. So there's a number of different topics that might be of interest, but plugging the fire for conservation management one today. Thank you. Back over to you, Joel.
Thank you for spruiking the course. It's great. And they actually have a question here around stepping us through the approval processes, and the course actually does that. So it provides a bit of a visual representation of what the guidelines say around that approval process. So if you haven't had a look, take a look. All right, thank you so much, Mel. Great work. As I say, Mel's been instrumental in putting together the guidelines for fire management. But you know, to reiterate that they are guidelines and that there is no one size fits all. So please, as a BCT agreement holder, if you need more information, you can chat with us at the BCT. And of course, other people you can chat to are the RFS. And we have two very diligent members of the RFS with us here today, Jane and Jamie. And they're going to talk to us now about the Hotspots program. And we're going to get their advice on designing and implementing a burn regime that provides ecological, cultural, and hazard reduction benefits. So thank you so much, Jane and Jamie, and take it away.
Terrific. Thanks, Joel. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners in my area where I'm sitting at the moment, and it's the Walbunja Nation that's part of the greater Yuin country, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. First of all, so you can see that beautiful critter on the front there, which is all part of the Hotspots mission, where we work with our partners to increase community understanding, confidence and capacity to sustain fire management for ecological and First Nations cultural outcomes whilst protecting life and property, which of course is one of the RFS's objectives under the Rural Fires Act, where we protect persons from injury, death, property and damage arising from fires, and protect infrastructure and environmental, economic and cultural, agricultural and community assets, from arising from fires. And importantly, the protection of the environment. Wildfire suppression is achieved as a result of hazard reduction burning, and this can be also successful for cultural and ecological processes. Now, Mel touched on a fair amount of this kind of information, but of course, hazard reduction is a priority for the RFS, and it's identified under the Act, so that becomes always the priority in regards to reducing the biomass. However, it also takes into account as subsects of the hazard reduction certificate process these days to take in either cultural burning or ecological burn focuses. Both cultural and ecological burns do offer unique benefits beyond just hazard reduction. In part of the Hotspots program, one thing that we do with people is create fire management plans. This is an example of one of those fire management plans. And this is something that you can also use as a pre-incident plan that you can share with your local brigade, because it tells them where lock gates are, where fences are, where power lines are, where your assets are, where they can access water, and so on. And you can develop these fire management plans to be ongoing, and we recommend that they are reviewed on a regular basis every 6 to 12 months. It identifies your management objectives and priorities as well. It also gives you good contacts, and those maps are an AO map that's laminated that you can update and change on a regular basis. Hotspots understands that a well-informed and well-prepared community complements the roles of land managements and fire agencies, and that a shared approach to fire management is critical in any form of planning. So Hotspots was set up on the premises that shared approach of fire management is critical in any form of fire planning. So we engage in the Hotspots program where we have agency staff in that local area directly around those properties that are engaged with the landholders, and we hold those groups in around about, well, the maximum is 30 landholders that we have at any one given time. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit too challenging for the nature conservation ecologists and the RFS hotspot staff to manage in that kind of a space, with the amount of work and information that we're trying to get through. So its vision is to support sustainable fire management for healthy landscapes. So we are looking to apply fire to the landscape to create those healthy landscapes. And one of the key messages that we like to include is the recognition of the different values that different landholders and fire management agencies have in their decision-making processes. So engaging with those agencies assists them in their decision-making processes, and it also helps you in managing your land management processes as well, in regards to knowing what they're seeking to achieve, when they're seeking to achieve it, and what their objectives are. And all of those objectives are also measurable objectives. So they are seeking outcomes that they can measure against what they're planning to do. They look at what species occur in the landscape and how they respond to fire. And we discuss that with each Hotspots program. It's about creating contacts for landholders, who you can talk to about fire and how to follow up. And you can see at the top there's a couple of email addresses that you can access to make requests for Hotspots programs to occur in your local area. I currently have one at the Canoolans area at the moment. We're about to do workshop 2. We do apply fire to the landscape within those workshops and do a demonstration burn to show how that process can occur. How do we identify appropriate fire burn regimes for your property? We use a very broad system of classification under Keith, which divides plant communities into very broad formations, some of which are broken down into sub-formations based on their different structures, whether they be grassy or shrubby. And they are used under the code, under the Bushfire Environmental Assessment Code, currently 2021, for acceptable fire range intervals for each formation or sub-formation applied. All of this stuff we go into great detail with the Hotspots program. One of the areas that you can access information for your fire regimes or, for your vegetation formations, that whether you know or not on your area, is a publicly accessible website known as Seeds. I'm sure many of you will already be aware of that, or you can use the app Trees Near Me that has been improved more recently to give even better detail of information. And it shows not just the formation, it shows the class type, plant community, whether it's a PCT, and goes into further detail for that as well. From there, we're able to establish the thresholds. So all bushfire risk management plans to date have the fire thresholds for that particular landscape identified embedded in the bushfire risk management plan. However, this is about to change with the next generation fire risk management plan, but you should still be able to access that information from your local fire control, where they can easily print that information out for you. And it shows you what the minimums and threshold is, where it will maintain the biodiversity. You can see there the minimum SFAZ, SFAZ, which stands for Strategic Fire Advantage Zone, which is where it's up against an urban interface, and it's often kept to the lower end of that threshold, where it will still have a biodiversity met, but they may drop some particular species as a result of the ongoing or more regular burning. However, the land management zones, the LMZs, are at their conservation best. So, for example, you can see a grassy woodland as a land management zone for a minimum threshold of 8 years, but its maximum threshold is 40 years before it starts to senesce, and you'll start losing species and even some seed bank. Again, we go into further detail at the Hotspots program in regards to that, to give you clearer information in regards to that. How burning can be utilised as part of a bush regeneration program. So that particular fire there is African lovegrass, and for those that are aware of African lovegrass, it is significantly problematic, particularly in the south coast and up on the Monero and the tablelands, in regards to its movement and love for fire. So fire will also promote its seed bank, but what it gives you the opportunity to do is follow up with control measures, such as the use of hand weeding, spot spraying, or a significant spray process, which a lot of the local agricultural people access on a regular basis. So planned burns can be utilised as a tool in bush regeneration programs to promote the growth of native vegetation, manage invasive species, and maintain the health of the ecosystem. But it's not a one-stop shop. Follow-up controls are essential. The best way that landholders can give effect to an integrated weed management program is to develop a plan of management highlighting the weed control method and their timing. And this is what the your fire management plan, management objectives and priorities can establish in the Hotspots program. We often engage local land services or DPI in regards to coming to the Hotspots program on areas where a particular weed is problematic. And we had that recently with the new Morella Hotspots program, where we had a significant issue with lovegrass. The next slide is in regards to environmental processes for getting cool burn undertaken with an EPA approval versus HRC and eco burn outcomes. So this particular, these two pictures in this slide were a Malua Bay, Gorilla Bay Hotspots program where we engaged the Walbunja Rangers. You can see they're using fire sticks to initiate the burn, and we went through and spoke a lot in regards to the cultural outcomes that the local mob were keen to see occur as a result of these particular burns. But we were also looking at the ecological outcomes. So a lot of the surrounding area had been impacted by the 2019-20 wildfires, except for this location. So it was an excellent site to prepare. So Mel spoke about the environmental approvals for the EPA process and other agencies, which were previously very drawn out, dealing with multiple agencies, legislation, having to engage ecologists for referral of environmental factors known as REFs, or we often call them REFs, and costing significant dollars. So the alternative method was the streamlining of the HRC process, which also brings about ecological outcomes. We just can't specifically call them ecological burns because it's under the Rural Fires Act. So it needs to be identified as a hazard reduction first before we can do the subsect of an ecological burn or a cultural burn. So it's issued under the Bushfire Environmental Assessment Code that identifies a significant bushfire hazard. So a significant bushfire hazard is a fire run that is anywhere between 100 and 150 metres in continuous fuel. And that also depends on the topography or the degree of slope that it's dealing with, which reduces the length. It provides the ability to approve fuel management works to private property and cuts through red tape. It's available on the RFS website. If you type in hazard reduction certificate, it will give you access to the instructions and also the application, which I'll go into shortly. The hazard reduction is what the hazard reduction is what the RFS seeks to reduce as an objective under the Act. Yes, Hotspots seeks both cultural and ecological objectives in its program. So when I write a hazard reduction burn plan, I'm writing that for either ecological and cultural outcomes, depending on the involvement of the local Indigenous First Nations community. Who implements the burn may also influence the outcome. So you can actually request a hazard reduction certificate where you are the implementer of the burn if you have adequate resources and are comfortable to do so. Hotspots helps with this process in regards to the education process. And we have participants get fully involved in the ignition of the fire under the guise and under the watchful eye of either Jamie, myself, or my other colleagues in regards to how we work through this. So we can engage you in the safe protocols to do so. So that would be under 100F under the legislation. If the RFS does the burn for you, it's 100G. So there's a very big difference in how those are written, because if it's under 100F, the RFS will not do the burn plan. They may assist in other things, but by and large, it's left up to the landholder to do. If it's 100G, they'll happily write the burn plan, do the preparation for the burn with the mitigation crews that are available, and they'll implement the burn. But it becomes a hazard. It becomes an RFS work site at that point, and generally speaking, you're not able to participate in the burn. This is what the application form looks like, and you can see there's actually a spot for management agreements on that form for which you can tick, and the RFS will adhere to the management agreement. It's advantageous if there's a copy of that that comes through. Otherwise, we contact the BCT to find out when that agreement was agreed upon. So when fuel management activities are in, it's used for when fuel management activities are and modifications of the native vegetation, 365 days of the year. It's generally used for the creation of asset protection zones, trees too close to home, thinning the understory, but it's also used for burning. Burning of land management zones when there's a significant fire run. The assessment looks at the zoning of the area. So under the e-portal of, it will show whether it's under rural land, conservation land, peri-urban, and that will be taken into consideration in the process. It also does the Aboriginal heritage assessment. It looks at the environmental impacts, threatened species, soil, because not all soils are ideal for burning, smoke management, impacts of roads, hospitals, power lines, frequency, and the intensity. Safety considerations, particularly in the peri-urban area. First of all, the Bureau of Meteorology is the one-stop shop. Fondly known as the BOM, enables you to search specific places, and that link there will give you your local area. You just type in the name of your local area and you will get a 7-day forecast, which you definitely need to be aware of. In the past, it was only 4 days, but now we can reach out to 7 days, which is relatively good. The further it goes out, the less reliable it is, but it will certainly tell us whether or not we are expecting high winds. It will also give you the Met-Eye information, which is more specific in regards to wind direction and intensity. So Hotspots actually works through the risks of burning, how, when, where, and what, and can make it all and how it can all work really well, or it can come undone at the drop of a hat. So, and you can see those lovely cool burns occurring there on the on those slides, and you'll see that there's no, in the top slide, there's no white ash on the soil, which indicates a very cool burn. And the second slide shows a very minimal flame height, indicating a very cool burn. And the outcomes, you can see the regeneration of the initial sprouters in that third one. The fuel assessment and arrangement, weather, topography, and aspects of any landscape prior to burning is an important part of how we actually do our burning, or the things that you need to be aware of. Again, Hotspots covers all of this in its programs. Is the burn in an area where there's power lines, and are there potential impacts? Different power lines exude different energy, and if you've got those massive big power lines, well, actually any power line with smoke can potentially arc. Other considerations are whether or not you're looking to burn in the restricted fire danger period, and that generally runs from October 1st to the 1st of April. During that time, you require a permit. Again, this can change at the drop of a hat in regards to if the conditions start drying. I know for the far south coast, it's permanently changed its fire danger period from the 1st of September to the 1st of April, because it knows that it gets strong westerly winds in August, and more often than not, there's a loss of fire. The unfortunate reality is a lot of people attempt to do their cleanup at the wrong time of the year. When we come into April, when there's, before the winds have picked up or the rain has arrived, we have an opportunity to do some burning, and then normally throughout that whole April through to September, there's plenty of opportunities. But it's always preferable we don't leave it to the last minute, because that's when we tend to push the barrel. There's also other things that you can look at where we have the asset protection standards, where these are free off the RFS website. The RFS website under resources has a plethora of information that's advantageous to access. In this case, it looks at how the best outcomes for establishing an asset protection zone. It has the standards for low intensity burning and the standards for pole burning, and it also shows the process as well. And further considerations is whether or not you need a permit to light a fire. So that's required during the fire danger period. When a proposed fire is dangerous next to a building, which is normally within 20 metres, and I've seen plenty of people try to attempt to light those things and come undone as a result. Or if you're in New South Wales Fire and Rescue or Fire Brigade district, so in the fire rescue area, and there are plenty of areas in the peri-urban interface that come into those areas. And of course, the other important process to make sure that your burning is safe is to notify the Rural Fire Service, or if you're on rural fire land. And that's including either, if you don't have access to a computer, contacting the local fire control. The QR code on there gives you the direct link into the RFS website. And the permit and burn notification on the back of that card, again, that we have at our Hotspots program, gives you some really good tips that you should ensure you tick all those little interesting things in regards to notifying your neighbours. Your neighbours are identified as north, south, east and west of your boundary, across the creek and across the road. And sometimes it can be challenging notifying neighbours, but if you nail a note on your neighbour to say, I'll be burning between these dates, you're normally covered. And of course, who to contact in getting a burn plan written or implemented. Now, this is a really interesting thing. The RFS will write your hazard reduction burn under, as I said earlier, under 100G. And will implement the burn if requested. But the RFS do take control of that burn site, and which means if you're looking to engage in participating in that burn, you'll be excluded, unless of course you have qualifications of bush firefighter. Some contractors have been engaged to write burn plans, as Mel was mentioning, and implement burns. Again, you need to discuss whether or not it becomes their burn site as well. But there are prescribed burning guidelines available on AFAC. You can see the links there. And I can assure you the RFS is leading towards AFAC qualification for all of its staff involved in prescribed burning, along with writing burn plans as well. So I would suggest that if you're seeking participants or you're seeking contractors to do burns and burn plans, not only look at their insurance, look at their qualifications, because if they're not AFAC qualified or their understanding of ecological burning, if it's under the RFS, their core burning, well, there's certainly plenty of questions you can ask to understand where that person's ecological understanding is. But I will say that generally members of the RFS burn under low intensity burning, and that is stated in their burn plans. And again, the burn plans have objectives, and they are measurable and accountable. Based on the available science and operational knowledge, the Hotspots program is a training program which provides landholders and land managers with the skills and knowledge needed to actively and collectively participate in fire management, planning and implementation for the protection and enhancement of biodiversity conservation. So that being said, I can only recommend to everyone that they attend a Hotspots workshop. But having said that, we are very limited in regards to how many staff we have to put these programs together and how many we can do in a year at this stage. So, but don't have that put you off. Make sure if you are interested, you put a request into into the Hotspots program, and I'll leave the rest of the slides to Jamie.
Thank you, Jane. Can everyone hear me all right? Joel? We all good? All right, thank you. So again of Joel. Yeah, look, firstly, I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I'm Jamie Bertram, Wiradjuri, Gumbaynggirr man, reside on Gumbaynggirr country up in the North Coast, Coffs Harbour. Pretty complex thing when we start talking about wage or fire. And I guess if you go back to the times when fire was used for cleaning country and managing country in a way that our ancestors and our old people used to do it. We did have all these, I guess, fragmented landscapes, different land managers, different landholders wanting to manage their country differently. And it was more, I guess, that the fire burned, it burnt down into, creeks, gullies, river systems, and was managed in a way that it didn't really affect much in the way of structures and buildings and stuff. Where now we've got such a complex, fragmented landscape, it's hard for us to be able to go and do those large, broad acreage cultural fires like the old people used to do. So I guess working with Aboriginal communities in my scope of work, I'm the Aboriginal Programs Coordinator for the Rural Fire Service. So I sit across the state. I was sitting in the Hotspots project up until more recent times, but I've always worked in this space with communities in regards to having Aboriginal people being out on country and managing the landscape how it was managed, but also building in that contemporary side of fire as well. So understanding that we've got that Western way of, you know, how we need to manage fire. You've got the notification process, you've got the burn permits, fire permits, you've got to have that, you know, look in those ecological communities in regards to issues with fire regimes and thresholds and all that. So, you know, the two work together very closely when it comes to the cultural fire and contemporary fire. The main thing, I guess, in regards to cool burning is that we need to do it at a time when the conditions are conducive, but to also when we think about cultural fire, it's not just about the fire, it's everything else that's built in with it. So we look at the landscape in general, we've got those, I guess, those cultural indicators that our people look at to know when it's time to use fire or when it's not time to use fire. So, you know, in your landscapes, you've got places where you need to exclude fire because of a certain plant species, or you've got certain species that might be nesting in a period of time when we need to think about, no, we don't want to be burning that landscape yet. We'll hold off until it's ready, until everything's finished doing what it's doing there. And I think people need to be able to, I guess, understand that on their properties, and we call it reading country. So you go out and you read your country, you know what's going on. Understanding what's going on in the landscape is important in regards to, you know, your flora, your fauna. There's also the cultural aspect around ceremony in regards to fire and certain storylines and songlines too that's built into some of this stuff. And, you know, clearing those grassy pathways to gain access to resource places, for example, was important for our people to know where to go. They need to go to ceremony, they need to go to a resource, they need to get to their next campsite, they want to go from saltwater country to freshwater country. The way those pathways were cleaned to gain access to them places was through fire. So cool burning was always there. And the two photos in my slide indicate, you know, you can see that big log on the ground, and that particular burn was done pre-2019 to 2020 at an Aboriginal community on Bundjalung country, which is just on the western side of the Clarence River. And you can see how that fire's past that big old log. It's been laying on the ground for so many years, fully seasoned, cured. The fire was cool enough to just pass that and didn't even take hold. The log didn't catch fire. So we're looking at those other values in the landscape in regards to biodiversity values, and Jane mentioned that before. You know, managing those is important for landowners as well, to encourage those things that need to seek refuge, to go up into those hollow logs and protect them. The top photo was done on Gumbaynggirr country, coastal sort of country down near Yarunga. And the photo indicates, you know, you can see through the landscape, you can see through the trees. It was a fairly grassy understory, a lot of themata grass, a lot of lamandra, very grassy understory with a few shrubs here and there, but it was very patchy mosaic. The fuel moisture was spot on for that particular day. It didn't reach up into the canopy. And it's against Aboriginal law to have fire in the canopy. We don't want fire up in the treetops, so we're just maintaining those, I guess, near surface fuels, and that fuel that's available ready for fire. So understanding, you know, the time of day, the wind conditions, reading your weather, and like you've got the bureau which helps you with that. But you as landowners know what goes on in your country, which way the winds come from at certain times of the year. So it's interesting, just sit and watch and look and work all that out, and that will give you some guidance, I guess, in thinking about when and to use it, when not to use it. You know, we know in the August months we get our strong westerly winds up this way, August, July, August, September. So sometimes coming off that arid country, hot, dry, arid country tends to be a bit hotter and drier. They'll drive our fires hard under certain conditions. But, you know, sometimes a late evening burns, there's nothing to stop you doing burning at night, potentially. You know, we don't have to do it during the day. People have got to think outside the box a little bit and think, well, conditions aren't good today, but maybe late this evening we can maybe do it and get those better, cooler burns in place. All right, you can go to the next slide there, thanks. One aspect, I guess, working with community and with agencies and representatives, this was actually a program I delivered, Hotspots project that I delivered at Tingha. This was after the Tingha Plateau fire. A few months after, this particular landscape didn't get hit with fire, but it burnt right around Tingha. But you can see in the photo the different agencies. So there was ranger groups there was landowners, there was the RFS, there was Aboriginal community members. So it was all about collaboration. It was all about sitting down, having a conversation about how we're going to go about doing this. What are our plans? Let's have a conversation about those aspects and values that we need to be looking out for in the landscape. And how do we go about protecting them from the impact of fire? In some cases, that conversation there was around the time since fire was put in that landscape by Aboriginal people, and it was an interesting time because the old fellow that was there, Uncle Jimmy, him and his grandson lit fire there. First time they had lit fire as Aboriginal people on that landscape for 60 years. So for them, that was a special time, special moment. So, and they took ownership of that. They took ownership of that burn. We were there to support them. Yeah, we had fire trucks and we had a few bits and pieces, but really we didn't need them. It was just backstop if needed. But certainly the community really did take ownership of that. And as landowners, there's nothing to say you can't take ownership of your burning and have agencies come in and help support that if you've got some sort of fire knowledge or fire skills to be able to do it on your own. But always have a backstop, always have something to fall back on if something does go bad. And I always say to the people, don't take too big a bite of the cherry because you'll hit the pip. So it's like putting fire on country. Put too much fire on country and things change during the day. The weather changes, wind picks up, humidity drops, temperature rises. Before you know it, the fire's taken a hard run and it's hard to handle. So just think small, I guess, to start off with in regards to thinking about these areas that you want to potentially put fire on. But collaboration is a key component to anything like this. And as an agency, we sit down, we have bushfire management committee meetings and we discuss, all the agencies come together and talk about fire management and hazard reduction and wildfire and what happens if and when. So we come together and have them conversations, no different to community members coming together, especially if they're landowners that join each other. And that's why Hotspots is a great concept, because it's about public land managers sitting down with private land managers and having a conversation about how we're going to manage fire in this bit of landscape, for example. And quite often parks have got vested interest to make sure that fire doesn't leave their country and vice versa. Private landholders or BCT landholders have got obligations to ensure fire doesn't leave their property and burn into someone else's land. So, it's about sitting down and have that conversation. Next slide there, thanks. So obviously, looking at that protection of those biodiversity values is crucial. Hollow bearing trees, logs on the ground, understanding where things seek refuge during an event. If you've been involved with any fire at any time, you stand long enough and a fire's burning around you and you'll have crickets and spiders sitting on your shoulder and climbing up the leg of your pants and all that sort of thing. So, birds, there's winners and losers. You're always going to have losers during fire. but there's always going to be winners. So you think about those insects that are moving from that fire, burning towards their habitat. They're on the march. The birds come in and forage on them. Then also post-fire, there's also winners as well in regards to those predators that come in that will seek those things that have been possibly burnt during the fire. So goannas and so forth. But then there's also the issue around feral species. So you've got to think of those species that will come in after, and what impact are they going to have on our native species, cats, foxes, and so forth. So because it opens the landscape up, gives access for those predator species to move in. Retaining those logs, hollow-bearing trees. How do we go about protecting them, for example? Well, it means identifying if you've got them in your landscape, how do you clean around them? What are the methods you use? Do you put a wet line around them with a hose? Do you rake the debris away from the base of the tree? All that business, especially if the trees or those hollows are being used by arboreal species. But there's those small microbats, species, arboreal species, and that don't need big hollows. So small microbats and that don't need very big hollows at all. They'll live roost under a piece of bark. So maintaining those values is important. So and the same with the logs on the ground. And the bottom photo indicates where we actually pulled the Tinga fire up. And I took the photo for a school route that I'd done, and there's a beautiful big hollow-bearing tree on the right-hand side that didn't get any fire impact. But I get the kids to point out that particular tree and what's a home for the animals that may live and use that tree. So they've got to point to the hole in the tree, the hollow in the tree. But a dead tree is a block of units, the way I look at it. Things live in it. It's got all sorts of things living in it. So we need to be retaining them and protecting them. All right, then, next one. Next slide. Protection of our waterways. We want to have clean drinking water. Our animals want clean drinking water. We don't want the impact of the wildfires that happened in 2019, the amount of soil loss and mass movement that occurred after those fires impacting on our streams, rivers, and into our gargle, our ocean, which then impacts on our reef system. So by maintaining vegetation around your riparian zones, your rivers, your streams, even your dams and large water sources, is important to maintain those values within biodiversity and aquatic life within the water systems. And we get enough mass movement through other forms of development and soil movement. Fire is one thing that will open the soil up. And you can think about what we've just had. We had the 2019-2020 fire season. What happened 12 months after that? We've had 3 years of rain. That 3 years of rain has impacted on those landscapes. And I took some trips down to the south and down in the Macleay Valley and right down into the back of Moruya. And there was mass movement of soil from those large fire events because of the rain events that we had afterwards, which then impacts on our river systems and our streams. So we've got to be thinking about that too. So it's important that we maintain fire and keep fire away from those places. And it's written into our code in regards to our streams and river systems and the order of streams, how close we should be putting fire to those areas. And we need to retain those buffers and maintain that vegetation along those places. Clean water, we need it. And everyone needs it. So we need to look after what we've got. But the flow-on effect from that, I guess, is the impact it then has on other environments like our reef systems and out in the ocean. So, yeah, next slide, thanks. Our cultural artefacts and cultural values. So protection of these, we've lost so much during those big fires. And I guess people understanding what they look like, where they are on the landscape. I guess some of the main things I'd be looking at was just your scarred or modified trees with those dry faces on them. We lose so many of them during fires, whether they've been modified by human hands or whether they've been modified naturally. You know, we need to be looking out for those things, and not just also for the biodiversity values and the cultural values, but also for our safety. As firefighters, one thing that takes a lot of our firefighters out is bad and dangerous trees that catch fire. So safety's paramount when dealing with this sort of thing. So keeping fire away from these values is important. But the way I look at it, that particular scar tree is actually up in the far north Queensland, but it was one that the old fellas took us to and said, you know, it wasn't a very big tree. They don't have to be big to be modified, to be scarred. I've seen them sometimes even smaller than that for coolamans and so forth. So, you know, if you know of these things in your country, on your country, you know, and whether it's recorded within AIMS, our Aboriginal Heritage Information Management System, we need to look after them and maintain them and keep them sacred and care for them. So very, very important aspect, the scar trees. The stones, rock arms, you know, artifacts, stone artifacts, tools, stone tools, they're everywhere. You've got to remember that Aboriginal people have been here for a long time. There isn't much of this landscape that we haven't walked over at some time, and things were left behind. Things were discarded. There was bartering that took place, and things were moved and put in places and hidden and dropped, or I found a better rock, I'll take that one, leave this one behind. Those are the things that happen. So in a lot of ways, my late brother-in-law used to say to me, we need to be burning more country, my brother. And I say, well, why is that? And he said, so I can find more artifacts. And a lot of the time when we do open country up, it hasn't had fire on it for a while, and if you walk over it, it's amazing what you'll find in the landscape afterwards. And a lot of the time, if there's been any sort of disturbance, mechanised disturbance, whether it be through logging operations or some sort of, you know, movement of soil in some way over the years or different times, quite often if you put fire over country and clean the grass and vegetation away, you'll start finding certain stones and artifacts that were uncovered. And a good example of that is in some of the early joint venture plantation establishments that happened across the state, where trees were planted for timber production. There were certain places up in the north where we'd gone through, the fire had gone through, and we'd found where those rip lines had been put in to plant those trees that had turned up artifacts that were buried in the topsoil. So for the community, it was a win because they'd found those things that were uncovered, and then they recorded them and kept them in situ and looked after them. And you've got to remember that anything's on your place, keep it in place, keep it in situ, record it, or hide it somewhere where it's not going to get impacted by other vehicle movements or machinery or people taking them off country. There's that cultural safety that comes into when certain things are taken away, that we need to maintain that on that country and that landscape, not take it away. The top photo is actually of a hide that was identified for hunting purposes for nungu or kangaroo. And so that was quite distinct on the top of a hill. And when we had the conversation about that, we said, well, how did they go about doing this? And they said, well, they'd use fire at the bottom of the hill to push the kangaroos uphill, upslope. They got to the top, they knocked up, they had to have a spell, the fellas come out and speared them from in the hides there. So it's another sort of cultural cultural value that was identified and protected. So everything's protected. Cultural values and cultural heritage is protected under the Cultural Heritage Act. So if there's things on your property and you know that they are recorded, they would be recorded in names, and if you knowingly destroy or harm those particular sites or values, fines can incur. So we need to ensure that we maintain those places. And fire also cracks rocks and so forth. So they're just a few examples. There could be stone or platform grooves, on stony platforms, especially down around the Sydney area in the sandstone country. You've got those big areas of flat rock, which would have stone engravings in them. They would be increased sites or ceremonial sites, stone arrangements, a whole range of different things that our old people would have used. Campsites, middens, for example, burial grounds, a whole range of things. You just don't know where some of these things are in the landscape. We've been quite lucky just recently where we've had a number of our mitigation teams, Aboriginal Torres Strait Island mitigation teams, come across some fairly significant sites in their preparation work for burning in different parts of the landscape. And so if and when potentially if there's work that needs to be done to prepare burning, these guys have gone through their cultural heritage and awareness inductions and training to be able to identify these values and find them on properties. And they've found them three really significant sites just recently in their on-ground work, on-country work. So, which is good because then there were sites that weren't recorded previously, so they had no record of them. We've then engaged with the local Aboriginal Lands Council and the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage officers to actually go out and assess the site. Sites were assessed, been deemed to be a place of significance, and then been recorded. So there are 3 new sites just recently that have been identified, it's good. It's a good thing. We need to be looking out for them. So you just don't know what's out there. And those 3 of those sites were on private property. They weren't on public land. Next slide there. Sharing of knowledge. So you think about, we sit down and have a conversation, and Hotspots is one crucial thing where we sit down and have that conversation. It's about people opening up, sharing their knowledge about what they know, how we can go about doing things, who are the best people to talk to. I guess networking, it's all about networking, Oh, I see that bloke driving that National Parks vehicle every month down that road, but I've never known who he was. So having that conversation during a Hotspots project or Hotspots fire program is a way of getting to know that person. Who's the person that sits in the Land Council, Aboriginal Lands Council? Oh, it's this particular guy here who's comes to the project. So it's about networking and building that relationship, sharing knowledge, bouncing off each other, supporting each other, collaborating. And those 2 photos, the 2 old fellas up the top, the old fella, I'll go, I guess, on my right with the bark in his hand. That bark was actually used as a drip torch, traditional way of using fire in Savannah country. And they're having a conversation about how they're going to go about doing the burning. But that old fella was the keeper of fire. He was the knowledge holder of fire. We talk about our organisation having an incident control, a planning officer, operations officer, logistics officer, all that. He's the one fella that knew all that stuff. He was the keeper of that. No fire could be used on that landscape without his knowledge or without him being informed or being part of that planning. So I guess it's about, you're going to be using fire and cultural fire, you need to ensure that our elders and the old people that have got that knowledge around those places is informed of that, especially if there's culturally strong sites within the landscape. And it's just about, that courtesy, burning those places that okay, yes, they may not own the land, but it's still a site that is strong and significant to Aboriginal people. So we need to ensure that conversations happen. It's all about, I guess, part of that reconciliation, breaking those barriers, kicking down those walls, and coming together and having a nice conversation about looking after those different values on country. The bottom photo was Uncle David and his granddaughter, and that was on their airstrip on an IPA, Indigenous Protected Area, up in far north. And you can see it was done at night because the fire conditions during the day weren't conducive. The wind wasn't properly blowing in the right direction. It wasn't doing its thing. So they had that conversation about, well, let's do it at night. So, sometimes it's the way to do it, but the photo, a bit hard to see, but the young girl, his granddaughter's got the bit of bark in her hand that she lit that bit of fire with. So that's that sharing of knowledge. The two old fellas having that yarn about how they're going to do it, and then the grandfather passing on his knowledge to his granddaughter. And that's how, a lot of times, that's how we learned through our old people. It was passed on. 65,000 years of knowledge passed down through songlines, storylines, those cultural stories, understanding country, looking at cultural indicators, was all, it's been brought down through generations, 500 or more generations of people having that, out there doing that work. So sharing knowledge is important. And like we're doing today, we're sharing our knowledge and imparting our knowledge onto everyone who's sitting in here today. I think that might be my last slide, eh?
Yeah, I think so. Goodness me, sorry.
Thanks, Joel.
Jamie, thank you so much. Talking about sharing of knowledge, there is so much in that presentation. It's incredible, like between yourself and Jane talking about, dare I say, some of the procedural stuff that has to come along with getting burns on country. But then to hear from you, Jamie, I feel like we're out there with you, having a yarn and learning on the ground. So that's an amazing presentation, and what a treat. Thank you so much. I'll bring everybody back. I can see Mel. Hi, Mel. You still there? Thank you. Sorry again, my voice is a bit crackly. We are 2:15. We're going to push through to 2:30. So if you've had a late lunch, it's going later. All right. Tell the boss you'll work back. He'll be right. It's fine. All right. So we've got some questions. Okay. And I'm going to go to Mel. Make sure she's still awake. So we've got a few questions around if it's mandatory for a strategic and operational burn plans to be prepared by contracted fire professionals for BCT agreements, or can landholders write their own?
My advice would be to have someone who has experience and qualifications to be preparing those documents, or under the guidance of someone who does have that experience. Particularly, I guess, where we speak about the operational burn plan, the intention is for that to be prepared by the person putting the burn on the ground, to really be more of a operational document. And I'd suggest that, if you don't have the qualifications and experience for that, it's probably something that's best to be left for a professional.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mel. Because there is a question there around what qualifications do you require for someone to write a strategic burn plan for a BSAR? And then you also mentioned too, Jane, around the, is it the AFAC? What did the AFAC? So would they work together in regards to would AFAC be a qualification that somebody could get to then be able to write these plans?
Someone can actually get the AFAC qualification. There are training courses available through AFAC. And as I had on the PowerPoint, there was the link there to AFAC and its different training packages. So it's not something that people can do without any fire experience, because there's the ability to understand fire behaviour before people actually go down that road. So they may want to engage with maybe a local brigade to gain some experience to understand fire behaviour. They'll learn some of that in a Hotspots program, where, as Jamie has discussed quite extensively in regards to that sharing of knowledge, and we go into quite a bit of detail. But again, that's not going to make them qualified to do things overnight. But it does, as Jamie also said, start small, because once you put the fire in, it's challenging to get it out. And it's one of the things that I always emphasise. And even if you start on a 2x2 square metre little area, that's a starting point for you to start to learn. Probably one of the best advices that I can ever give anyone is if they've got a fire pit and they go and gather all the different types of vegetation around their property, dry, green, and then light their fire pit and sit around the fire pit, have a good yarn, and start by holding those bits of vegetation above the fire to see how volatile they are, whether they just melt, whether or not they start to crisp up, or whether or not the oils in there ignite, or at what point that ignition point is. And that will start to educate people in regards to the different vegetation types they have around their area, around their in their landscape, and how volatile those are. Even cottage garden vegetation can be highly volatile. Just look at the lavender plant, for example. Lots of oils in there, light really easily, and how many people have got those around, right up against their houses. So we look at all those different things. We talk about those different things. I've forgotten what else I was going to say. Sorry.
No, that's a great tip. I have to try that in my fire pit at home.
Yep.
My small backyard. See what the
good.
neighbours say.
Game the whole family can play, really.
Yeah, that's right. Get my daughter in.
And it educates the young ones. It's that sharing of knowledge again. Yeah. Start young. I teach my grandnephew at this age as well, and he's only a year and a half.
Go for it, Jamie.
Just back to I just with the planning, it's important to understand that you need to have a map of your site and knowing where you're going to actually be setting up. So the project, the Hotspots project, you've got your fire management plan, so you can identify in that landscape where you want to use fire, where you want to exclude it. But if you're going to have an exclusion zone, what is going to be the barrier or buffer to stop that fire burning into that? So you've got to have some sort of physical barrier to maintain that fire and stop it burning into those places you don't want it. So the other important aspect that people need to be aware of, that we need to have containment strategies in place to ensure that fire is maintained within the parcel or that area that we want to burn. So those containment strategies could be mineral earth, could be an existing track, trail, road in the landscape.
Animal pad.
It could be a wallaby track, could be a cow track, it could be some sort of barrier, it could be a wet line, could be a fuel moisture differential even.
Mm-hmm.
In your fuel load, in your fuels, where you're going from that sort of dry sclerophyll into maybe a bit of wet sclerophyll, and that delineation between those two veg types, shaded areas. So people need to be able to maintain that, and that needs to be documented in their planning process, so that when they're actually going to do it, this is where we're going to burn from. We're going to identify an anchor point. We're going to burn from this corner, and we're going to push the fire. Origin of fire will be here, and we'll push it in a certain direction with the wind or against the wind, however it might be, downslope, all those things. We tend to, and I guess it's about people being able to read fire, and it's something that doesn't come quickly. You've got to have a lot of years, I guess, knowing, that fire doubles its rate of spread going uphill and all that, all that sort of business. So, a lot of the time we say to people, if you want to be putting fire in broad acreage stuff, maybe lighting from the top of a ridge and letting it back down slope. So we call it a backing fire, where the flames are laying back on the stuff that's already burnt, whereas if you put it at the bottom of a hill, it's preheating all that vegetation and fuel in front of itself, which intensifies the fire activity. So people being able to read all those aspects, looking at their terrain and maintaining it within that parcel, and having it written down, because the burn plan itself is a safety note as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I've got this written down. I'm going to abide by this safety note. Identify dangerous trees. Can I actually get my vehicle across that bridge, which has only got a 1 ton load limit? I'm going to put a 5 ton truck over it. these are things that people, as private landholders, need to be thinking about. And as firefighters and fire commanders, like I've been in the past, can I get my crews in there safely to be able to maintain a fire? Because no, the track's not suitable, there's a bog or there's a dead end road or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all the things that people need to think about when they're actually planning. Very important.
And
Thanks,
one
Joel.
thing I just will mention, if someone is looking at preparing documents for a biodiversity stewardship agreement, an application, I recommend you get in touch with the Nature Markets and Offsets team who will be reviewing the application and just double checking that with them to confirm as well.
Thanks, Mel. And there was a question there around grants and grants for burning and burn planning. So how does the grants, the program wasn't, but here there might be changes. Is that right, Mel?
Yeah, so the grant guideline states that there's currently no funding for burn implementation, whether that's ecological or cultural, but we are looking into grant funding for the burn planning component. So watch your space.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great because I know that's been, well sought for a while.
Yes.
Like so many others. Quick one there for you, Jane. Can you clarify what you mean by 100F or 100G?
So under the actual legislation, there is 100G, which is about RFS deliberately working in that area. 100F is about landholders wanting to do work themselves that doesn't involve the RFS. More often than not, they've involved the establishment of asset protection zones or clearing trees within an asset protection zone, but it does also work for applying fire to the landscape as well.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. I think that 100F and 100G, is that like they're lines in the Act? Is that right? They're like...
They are actual lines in the Act, yes. Yep. So there's a whole list of different pieces of legislation that all start with 100 A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it goes right down to about K. But the 100F and the 100G are specifically related to the hazard reduction certificate process.
Perfect. Thank you. The question around doing an ecological burn but not approved through HRC process, what other pathway can I take? That would be the EPA approval pathway, I imagine?
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's a long, challenging way because their preferred method is anything else bar burning or clearing. So as Mel said earlier, it's related to landscape clearing, and even under local land services, it's a similar process as EPA.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And if you wanted to get started at that, contact your local council for their local environmental plan and to see how it's categorised as a first step.
Thanks, Mel. A question sorry, Jane, go for it. Yeah.
I was going to say further to that, when Jamie made mention about burning of a night time, there are some councils who don't allow burning of a night time, and where we're doing a workshop at the moment up at Canoolans is one of those because they're at the top of the hill and it often leads smoke into the Sydney Basin. So the EPA's Clean Air Act comes into work there.
Yep, that's a good point, and that inversion sets down at this time of year too. So once you get them inversions, you'll get the smoke settle and sit. But that's a good point. Good, thanks, Joan.
A question I actually had myself, which I think a lot of people out there would have, is around that sort of continual burning and being able to work through hotspots or others to be able to have it set up a schedule. So if a landholder comes to you to, hotspots and through the HRC or another means is able to get, burn on country, can they have it set up so that, effectively like, oh, okay, I'll see you next year, same thing again next year, but on different part of the property? Can you, or is it literally a single burn event that is planned and approved?
Well, the reality is if it's RFS implementing the burn, their priorities are always going to be their strategic fire advantage zone areas under the bushfire risk management plan. So land management zones fall down in the priority process of having those burns that happen. So they might get one year and then they may not come back for some time depending on their priorities. So and the challenge is, and as we have both Jamie and I have been stating, start small And you'll always, and the science is quite clear in regards to increased biodiversity is about doing small mosaics over a landscape. So you've got different fuel ages over time, and even cultural burning identifies that process as well, except for some of those other areas where they're trying to create pathways. So in that sense, this is where the challenge is for those in BCT areas, because we do, and through the Hotspots program, we do encourage those smaller areas, which is why we make the statement, start small, learn how to manage and understand fire behaviour before you progress from there. The good thing about the program is when we do the demonstration burn, it's a different perspective for a lot of people who haven't been involved in fire in the past, because they're used to seeing large fire activity, not cool burns. So that's a penny drop for a lot of people in regards to what can be achieved in doing things small and then progressing from there. The hazard reduction certificate can be issued just for that small area, and they can go back next year for another area that's small as well. They don't cost anything. They're absolutely free. And that information feeds back into the RFS when they've completed that burn, and they've got that history there as well, so they can lodge that in their file system so that they've got that information over time, that if they want to lodge another hazard reduction certificate, they've got that information, they've got photo monitoring, and we encourage all of those processes through the Hotspots program. It is a significant program that's over 2 days minimum, and we will often come back and do a FireWise program as well, which teaches people about preparation processes for wildfire.
I guess the other thing too, just to add to that, the actual certificates are for 5 years. That's still the case, isn't it, Joan? There hasn't been any change to that, I don't think.
No, they haven't. So they go from 1 to 5 years for burning, not necessarily for anything else. Mechanical work, generally only 1 year, but for burning 1 to 5 years. So if you don't get that burn done that first year, you can come back and do it again the next year.
And I guess that's an important concept. If people have got those places that they've identified, or those landscapes they want to use fire, the certificate can cover those different areas, and you can get that mosaic over that 5-year period to put fire on in those areas that they want to do. So I guess, as Jane raised, it's important to think about those assets, man-made assets, your homes, your structures, your buildings, maintaining that landscape around there, and then looking at the bigger picture. And then we look at those, we talk about those strategic fire advantage zones, and then the land management zones. Certainly, people can do that in their mapping program, or their mapping work that they get when they do a program, to identify those, set those management areas up, and set their objectives and actions and how they're going to do it. It's not just all about fire either. I think people have got to understand that, you don't necessarily want to, if you don't want to put fire in some areas, because I guess I'll use this for an example. My daughter lives in Western Australia, Margaret River. People hate fire there because it taints the wine. True story. So they prefer to do other forms of fuel reduction, and whether that's through grazing or slashing or whatever it might be. So it's just something else to think about, I guess.
Thanks, Jamie. And thank you guys. I think we're after 2:30 now. We've kept you guys long enough. Thank you so much for your time. We've still got a raft of questions. The battery's running out on this thing. It's gone hot. Excuse the pun. But we will, as I say, we'll look to try to get back to everybody, answer a lot of these questions that we didn't get to. Thank you again for coming in and being involved. And thank you at home for tuning in to what is going to be, our final conservation webinar for the foreseeable future. And don't get up in arms. Don't tip over the chair or the table. All right? You can still find me online on the BCT YouTube channel and through that online course that I was talking about. Lots of videos of me up there, lots of information for you. Thank you so much again for being involved, and as I say, it's been a pleasure for me to be able to deliver these webinars, and I hope that you can continue to engage with us here at the BCT, and through Hotspots. One of the things we did learn today was that it can be complicated space, but there's lots of ways for you to get involved and to get burn on country if you're interested. So I recommend you either speaking with us at the BCT as an agreement holder or contacting people like Jane and Jamie at the RFS to be involved there. So thanks again. And to sign off, as I said, we'll show you a video of a cultural burn that was undertaken recently on a conservation agreement at Bostabrick. It's on the Dorrigo Plateau on Gumbungia country. It's also a story of a great friendship between BCT landholder James Whitington and Gumbungia and UN man Philip Marsden. Phil works with the Urunga Aboriginal Corporation, who along with elders from Urunga and national parks led a burn on the property. It was also a cultural learning event for up-and-coming burn trainees, ensuring they gain the knowledge and experience needed to lead their own burns. So take a look, and once again, thanks so much, and I'll see you around. Cheers, guys.
When I plan a burn, first thing I do is inspect the area, see what is needed. I often look for animal tracks to see which is the best place to put the escape route, because you need to make sure that all the animals get out. Once I've done my assessment on it, I will get in touch with Rural Fire Service and put the date in or close to, because you can never ever just say I'm doing it on this day, because it never works that way. You have to have probably nearly a week sometimes just to make sure that you're getting the right day for the weather and the burn. Everything has to be right to be able to have that controlled fire.
Making neighbours aware of what's going on is important. Some neighbours are more touchy than others. They don't actually, some of them don't agree with burning. And consequently, their properties become fire dangers, actually. But yes, they understand that if they're notified properly, they have to support it. And if you can invite them, it's a really good idea as well, because then they're participating in it, they can learn how it's done, and they can become more accepting about it happening. With neighbours, the more they know and the more they're involved, the better. I've asked Phil where he considers the dangers will come from, and that's why we're working down by that river Blady Grass section now first, because it is the most dangerous area, and that's where the fires are likely. If there's a bad bushfire, likely to come through there and then up the side of the hill and onto this plateau. And then we'll deal with any other dangers that are probably lesser, but not to be disregarded. So just work away at it like that, and keep it as a constant part of farm management.
When I'm planning a burn, I found that in the winter months is the best time to do it, because the land cools down at night time, especially in Dorrigo. In another month or so, we're going to start getting frost. So if used, then I can safely burn it down to the creek, and it's going to go out down there because of the cooler weather, and you don't lose it, and that's the time. In a cultural sense, it's another thing is that you look at the animals and when they're coming and going, and then you look at it and go, okay, then this is the time to do that, because the animals now will start to go back out into the forest because it's come cooler and they're more protected out in the forest. So that's when you can get doing the burns. My burns, I've got a system in place, mosaic burning, and it goes over many years and you do the full circle around the whole property, and then by the time you've done that, you go back and you start again, and it goes around in about 3 or 4 years' time. It's back to having all the natural stuff. The weeds are gone because they've either been burnt out or taken out, and and it's after you've done all this, it's incredibly the wildlife that comes back into play, and that's what's needed. My advice for other landholders is to take, even look at into how the cultural burns work, and be shown the truth, and what can happen if you achieve this, and plus your land would be a lot safer in the long run if you started this practice. And I do believe that it's something that we're going to have to. We don't have much of a choice in the way the world is at the moment, but we're going to have to start to cool it down in a way. Instead of having these big fires, cool it down, and we can get the cultural practices into place